Hi, and thanks for watching my presentation. Today, I'd like to talk about urban mobility as a creative practice. And I would like to start by pointing out how awkward it is to be talking about urban mobility in the middle of a pandemic, when for a long time most mobility was halted. As many places in the world, lively urban spaces like Rio de Janeiro's downtown turned into ghost towns. This is a picture of Saara, one of the most popular street markets in downtown Rio. And even now, when some places like the United States seem to be returning back to normal, other countries still see severe impacts on mobility trends. But the problem with these graphics is that they assume that everyone moves the same. And even if we know that that's not the case, they conflate different types of mobility. I also would like to highlight that, as you probably know, those reports are produced with an aggregation of people's cell phones location data. This is my particular location history for the month of August. As you can see, I didn't move that much. So these are really interesting times where we can use mobile technologies to control or prevent mobility or as an indicator of urban mobility. In my research, I'm especially interested in the ways urban mobility is possible or prevented when in combination with the use of mobile communication technologies such as smartphones and all the mobile devices embedded into our urban network spaces such as sensors, Bluetooth beacons, all sorts of location-based technologies. And I'm also especially interested in how our interactions with these technologies can be considered creative. And I'll get to that, to what I mean by creativity a little later in this talk. So today I want to ask the questions, what does urban mobility mean when people are not able to move? What happens when people need to be creative in order to move? And why that matters? To answer these questions, we need to pay attention to the ways our daily lives are increasingly connected with mobile and location-based technologies. And in question in turn, what this connection or alternate forms of connection mean. So back in 2006, I described the term hybrid spaces to denote the experience people have when walking around urban spaces, constantly connected to other people via mobile communication technologies. Acknowledging the existence of hybrid spaces highlighted the fact that the spaces where we live our daily lives were no longer virtual or physical, they were hybrid. As such, our social spaces and social interactions and mobility happen across physical and digital spaces. Most importantly, the idea of hybrid spaces acknowledges that digital information and distant connections need to be taken into consideration as part of our co-present interactions, not as a distraction that takes us elsewhere. The idea of hybrid spaces is at the core of what Eric Gordon and I call net locality. The concept of net locality was a pushback to this romantic idea of globalization, which emphasized that local places and spaces would matter less than remote connections. The dichotomy that Manuel Castells called the space of flows versus the space of places. According to that logic, widely followed in the late 2000s and the late 90s and early 2000s, local spaces would give in to flows of information, capital, and the mobility of the global elites. In the book, we also criticize the idea that the internet is global and that people are increasingly connecting with people and information that's far away from them. While that's obviously also true, we know that we, in fact, mostly access information and people that are geographically close to us. Our location-aware phones, for example, center the maps around our physical location. My hyperlocal news app prioritizes what happens around me. And of course, my weather app would be useless if it didn't give my local weather first. Acknowledging that we live in hybrid spaces and in network localities has several implications for how we understand urban life, mobility patterns, and social interactions in public urban spaces. Specifically, living in hybrid spaces change how we experience and move around our lived spaces, and how we develop urban sociability. And in particular, I have often focused on creative ways of experiencing hybrid spaces. And by creative here, I mean the practices that develop by means of play and art mostly. For example, in the past, my co-authors and I have argued that location-based games and public art projects can help people become familiar with unfamiliar spaces. That was the case of the About Fighters player who would drive to unknown places of Stockholm in Sweden to shoot some unknown robots with text messages. For those of you who are not familiar with it, But Fighters was a location-based game created in the early 2000s, one of the first of its kind, that was played via text messages, where players could virtually shoot each other with text, depending on their physical distance to each other. And similarly, Moji players would organize expeditions around Tokyo to go to unknown parts of the city and catch virtual creatures. If this sounds a lot like today's Pokemon Go experience, this is not a coincidence. Pokemon Go was certainly inspired by these early experiences. Alternatively, these creative projects have the potential to make people see familiar spaces with the eyes of a tourist. There are many early mobile media art projects that accomplish that, but these are just two examples that I'm going to show, which you might be familiar with. In 2001, the German Chaos Computer Club transformed the whole facade of a building in Alexanderplatz in Berlin into a giant computer screen. And by being able to play Pong with other people and send love letters, passersby could use their phones to interact with the architecture of the city. Similarly, Lozano Hammer's Amodo Suspension in Japan encrypted text messages participants would send to each other and transformed them into searchlights that would hover at the sky over the Yamaguchi Center in Tokyo. I'm bringing up these early projects, well, first because I really like them, and also because they're among the first to demonstrate how hybrid spaces come into fruition through the creative uses of mobile technologies in urban spaces. So both of these projects make people experience the public space where they live in quite unusual ways. And familiarity with these spaces leads to familiarity with the people in these spaces, and therefore to potentially new types of sociability. So for example, in the past, we wrote about how viewing on the map of an app like Foursquare that specific places were popular matched the player's profile. People would go out and meet like-minded people with whom they would otherwise not have a chance to meet. Foursquare was not the first location-based social network that did that, and others like Loop and Brightkite preceded it in quite similar ways. And we can say that these early apps and games promoted not only creative ways of interacting with technologies and experiencing urban spaces, but also creative ways of moving through these spaces. Creatively moving through spaces, though, it's not a new practice. Larissa Horst and I described the ways in which this situationist international practice of derive are in many ways related to contemporary location-based games and mobile media art. A derive is an unplanned journey through the landscape where chance and unpredictability rule the way people navigate urban spaces. One can derive alone, but the most successful derives are in groups, so that the derive is inherently a social experience. And similar to the derive, the parkour experience is also a creative way of moving across urban spaces. In addition, the parkour challenges the traditional ways in which people are expected to move through the architecture of the city. By defying gravity, parkours appropriate urban spaces in unexpected and playful ways. Just like the parkour and the derive participants, location-based game players might also drift through urban spaces, just guided by the rules of the game. For example, while playing Pokemon Go, somebody might just, mostly play during commute, spinning Pokestops along the way, but they also might specifically go out to the raids following the hatching of eggs or searching for specific nests in parks. And while the parkour, the derive, location-based gameplay, and mobile media art projects all entice creative ways of moving through cities and exploring space, their analysis very rarely takes into consideration the uneven mobilities that also often construct these spaces. Differential spaces and differential mobilities are part of the urban mobility experience, but they have very different meanings in different parts of the world. For example, playing Pokemon Go in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, which is your picture on the left, is very different than playing in Cary in the US, where I live, which is on the right. These different experiences are not only defined by culture, but also by different urban geographies, socioeconomic and gender and race inequalities, and power imbalances. And so for the past 10 years, I've been looking at the ways low-income communities, and especially in slums in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, can appropriate mobile technologies and creative use them, often in ways that are subversive and not expected by technology designers. And this research has led to an investigation of the ways creativity is normally defined in scholarly circles, and in an attempt to define a new way of looking at this intersection between creative practices, the construction of spaces, and mobile technology use, something which I call mobile networked creativity. And so in the remaining of this talk, I'm going to talk about how this concept differs from the traditional ideas of creativity, and how we can understand creativity as a set of interrelations between space, mobile technologies, people, and mobilities. And so in our quest to understand the ways that creativity has been conceptualized in many different fields, Mei Kyung and I found that creativity is mostly defined, one, as an artistic practice, second, as an individual process, and third, it is synonymous with innovation. So this first one, creativity as an artistic practice, matches some of the examples I have just talked about because it's easily related to art projects. As an artistic practice, creativity is typically framed as a product of the imagination, intended to express original ideas. This idea of creativity was actually first documented in 1875 to describe Shakespeare's work. And more recent trends in creativity studies, which are mostly within management studies and organizational studies, focus on visual, musical, and literary artists and the creative aspects of their work. This traditional idea, however, overlooks many things, and especially non-artistic practices, and also ignores the power dynamics at play, overlooking the fact that some creative ideas are not always good. For example, creating a bomb with a cell phone or hacking an internet server. But terrorists and hackers are also creative. And from this perspective, we can see that creativity is not always artistic, and that to understand creative practices, we need to look at the power dynamics involved in the creative process, as well as how it communicates about social, economic, and political inequalities. Creativity is also frequently associated with novel or good ideas that are achieved by intense personal reflection, concentration, and contemplation. The Shakespeare picture I showed earlier is a good example of this, but other classical examples are, as you can see in the picture, Newton looking at an apple, Archimedes having his personal eureka moment in the bathtub, or Rodin's The Sinker. These examples focus on individuals as sources of the creative process rather than the network relationships among people, spaces, and technologies. Recently, the idea of creativity has been expanded to include the cognitive process of groups of people. So, for example, the internet, computers, and the World Wide Web have developed as a product of many creative minds working together. And Stephen Johnson, in his book Where Good Ideas Come From, make this point very clear. And so do other history of technology projects such as Hafner and Lyons, where the wizards stay up late, or Janet Abbott's inventing the internet. The so-called Web 2.0 has been also extensively studied as a place where information and knowledge production is the outcome of the collective participation of users. Pierre Levy named this process collective intelligence. But these ideas all still focus on people as propellers of innovation. And also in these accounts, the creative process is mostly associated with technological innovation, which leads us to the third frame of creativity, which is creativity as innovation. As we know, an increasing number of trade publications today aim at teaching people how to be more creative or how to come up with more innovative ideas. Often embedded into capitalist forms of production and consumption, creativity in this case is used as like a catch-all word for enticing people to work harder, beat competition, and be successful in the workplace. Several companies such as Google, which I'm sure you're familiar with, institutionalized this innovation time as a way to support employees' creativity, often for the benefit and profit of their own company. As such, creativity is frequently conflated with innovation as the spread of new ideas. And innovation comes out of the belief that individuals can be coaxed into being creative. In this way, creativity becomes associated to ideas and things that are novel or new and unique. But what I want to show here is actually that what creativity does is to repurpose what already exists. In the field of communication, and more specifically in mobile communication, there are several attempts to understand creative practices, and particularly under the umbrella of diffusion, adoption, and appropriation of technologies. While I'm not going to go into details about each of these approaches, I would like to highlight Barr, Pisani, and Weber's model, which defines three phases of technological appropriation: Baroquization, creolization, and cannibalism. Their model is relevant here, and I just wanted to call attention to that because it contextualizes appropriation and consequently creative practices within socioeconomic and political practices. In addition, they acknowledge that cannibalism, the last phase of their model, emerges from power struggles between creators and users of technologies. They also emphasize that cannibalism is a political process and a negotiation of power and control over the configuration of technology use and its diffusion. In this context, mobile network creativity emerges when we think of the creative cycle as emergent and ongoing, and where the relationship between people and technologies are symbiotic. So rather than proposing that creativity emerges from individual users or even from a social network, we propose that a network context that is equally composed by technologies, people, and their environments. This definition also highlights the power imbalances and political issues that are both embedded in and propel creative practices. So, in short, mobile network creativity is a spatial and network process that takes into consideration the mobilities and immobilities of populations and their access to mobile technologies and network resources, and even when, and actually especially when, this access is precarious. So first, mobile network creativity is a spatial practice. That is, it's shaped by the spaces where it develops. And here I just want to bring up this example in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, where services like Movet, which are notorious for not working properly. So Movet is basically an app that shows the real-time location of a bus or a train. And these apps are supposed to improve traffic flow and to decrease users' wait time. But they need a minimum of infrastructure to work, such as buses equipped with GPS and maintenance, which are, for the most part, lacking in Rio. As a result, buses' arrival times displayed on the app are often wrong, and the app is useless. And in addition, bus companies sometimes reduce the number of bus lines circulating in the city and change buses' routes without properly informing the population. This was the case of a specific line, Bus 581, that goes from Cosme Velho to Gávea, two neighborhoods in the south zone of Rio de Janeiro. And over the course of a few months in 2018-2019, a fleet of several buses was reduced to one line. Passengers have waited over an hour at the bus stops. And at some point, in order to help the passengers, the only remaining bus driver, what he actually did was create a WhatsApp group to broadcast to potential passengers the real-time bus locations, departure and arrival times. So my cousin was actually one of the people in this WhatsApp group. And the people in that WhatsApp Buzz 581 community did not invent a new technology, nor they used automated location awareness. But out of the difficulty in urban mobility and lack of public resources, they came up with a creative way to network. Second, mobile network creativity is a networked practice. That is, it emerges from these interactions of several human and non-human actors. In recent years, rental electric bikes and scooters became popular in large urban centers in Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo and other cities around the world as well. But this popularity also led to several types of black markets and subversive practices. Scooters meant to be rented through the apps were stolen from the streets and increasingly sold in online platforms like a Facebook Marketplace. They were then advertised online for about, as much as $200. The scooters obviously no longer worked as intended, so rental location-based public transportation were turned into a standalone private traditional scooter. And in these cases, the thieves were able to disable the tracking system of the scooter and in many cases used the stolen scooter to steal cell phones in the south zone of Rio. And creativity in this case does not only emerge from a class of users, it's a network including thieves, buyers, sellers, scooters, mobile devices, Facebook Marketplace, Rio de Janeiro streets, and other urban and digital infrastructures. My examples so far focus heavily on mobility, urban mobility, the mobility of networks and mobile technologies. And as we have seen with the examples of location-based games and mobile media art I showed earlier, mobility and mobile practices are at the core of how creative practices unfold. But as Hannah, Scheller, and Nuri point out, for some people to move, others need to stay still. In this case, the very lack of mobility, social, physical, and economic mobility, is what facilitates creativity. For example, in a study about how people in slums in Rio use cell phones, we talked about the practices of diretão, which was a cell phone that allowed people to call anywhere in the world for 10 minutes when they had to hang up before the call could be tracked by the cell phone provider. The diretão was used by drug dealers mostly, who had a direct contact within the cell phone provider. And while this phenomenon was clearly an example of cannibalism, according to Barr's definition, emerging from the power struggles among providers and users, where users subvert the system, it's also an example of mobile network creativity, where the creative practice emerges from a subversion from within the system itself. In addition, it provides virtual mobility to people who normally cannot afford to move freely, and in many ways were locked into prisons. The diretão is a good example of how creativity also emerges from economic inequalities and power dynamics between high and low income populations. And the diretão example is actually part of this cycle of illegality and insecurity that we have further explored in a study about the illegal circulation of cell phones in Rio. While we normally think about mobility as human mobility, in this study we're actually trying to understand the mobility of the device itself, what happens when it arrives on the market, is sold, stolen, sold again, and used as an illegal cell phone. And we interviewed several mobile phone vendors at the Uruguaiana market, the location that I showed at the beginning of this talk in downtown Rio. Also, we interviewed people who usually buy these phones at the market and the police who works to prevent the black market. And mobile phones are actually one of the most stolen items in Brazil, and either a fear of losing their phone or for a lack of economic power, people look for cheap alternatives. And these cheap alternatives can be generic phones or stolen phones. Generic or pirate phones, as you can see in the picture, are phones which are not certified by, in Brazil's case, the National Telecommunications Agency, Anatel, because they normally transmit a radio frequency that do not meet the safety standards of national cellular networks. However, they're increasingly sold illegally with cloned IMEs and enter the country smuggling, and or they're just robbed. And they're actually in general 1/3 of the price of their original counterparts. Stolen phones are of course original, but are sold as new or used on the black market. Often they come even in the original box because they come from stolen trucks who are delivering freight, or they come from street robbers. The generic phone especially is a way of working around solution, jeitinho, as anthropologist Roberto da Mata would say, that would bypass the difficulty of not being able to afford a new phone, even if that solution is precarious. It gives them access. Cell phone theft in Rio in particular was a key determinant that influenced the behavior of the Pokemon Go players we interviewed in a recent study. It is a common practice in the city to steal phones of those who are seated by the window on buses. And so players told us that they would either not play in public transportation or play only when standing up in the middle of a crowded bus. This is a key finding that actually happened both in Rio and Nairobi, because it indicates the creative ways in which players need to behave to adapt to the context of insecurity where they live. And in particularly, I would like to emphasize how subversive game practices become creative workarounds to deal with the context of illegality and insecurity in which players live. One of the most common practices we observed in our interviews is spoofing GPS location, or as the Brazilian and Kenyan players call it, fly, in opposition to the Shin player who has to typically physically walk by foot. Spoofing is an illegal and therefore subversive game action, and it occurs everywhere, but for different reasons. In Rio and Nairobi specifically, a significant number of players told us that they fake location to avoid the dangers of going out at night to do a raid, specifically if they are women. And as a result, although fly is condemned in North American contexts, it is much more widely accepted in Brazil and in Kenya. And as you can see from this Pokemon Go WhatsApp raid group in Rio, people call for a raid, and group members, they actually, they signal that they will fly to the location by putting an airplane or a bird besides their name. And these players are creatively transforming a mobile practice into an immobile experience that still allows them to participate in the network of players. And as I mentioned in the beginning of this talk, location-based games have so far been mostly studied among global north homogeneous contexts, which are for the most part highly planned and safe urban spaces. Our findings reveal that players in both cities negotiate their mobilities in creative ways based on concerns for safety, avoiding areas known for physical violence and theft. Such insights not only enrich our understanding of Pokemon Go in particular and location-based games in general, but also helps us understand how ordinary life, local cultures, and socioeconomic inequalities are intrinsically coupled with gameplay and creative practices. Creativity from this perspective includes the adoption and adaptation of ideas that sustain a community's survival. Sometimes it requires working with tools that are not necessarily designed for the survival or use. And these are just some examples that I showed here, but there are of course many more. For instance, here we can see the phone ladies in Bangladesh, the first to rent mobile minutes as payphones to serve disconnected communities. Or gatos in Brazil, Brazil's LAM, which are cats, clandestine wire connections to the city's utility services. And mobile cell phone charging stations that use solar power as electricity in Africa. So to wrap up, mobile network creativity then emerges from this set of relationships that develop and overlap over space and time as a social response to unplanned or emergent situations. It also emerges from a system of power struggles and frictions against normative forces. All these examples, although extremely different, have some things in common. First, they acknowledge that people and populations who are at a disadvantaged position often need to be creative to propel their mobility and to become part of hybrid spaces. Second, they show that the problem is not that people don't have access to technologies, but that they learn how to access them by subverting their use. And third, they show that creativity is hardly an individual process. Rather, it is a recursive process that occurs in combination with technologies. not by actually using them, but making them part of us, or part of who we are. And here, I'd like to kind of look back to the beginning of my talk, and just to say that one of these things that the COVID-19 crisis highlighted is how mobility is uneven and how it actually inverted traditional mobility practices. So for example, these people who are placed by excellence and who don't have the privilege to move, like slum dwellers or low-income communities, are those who actually couldn't stop moving. These are the people who work on essential jobs and had to go to work, or who don't have proper access to the internet and therefore couldn't afford to working remotely as I am right now. These people are not surprisingly disproportionately suffering with the pandemic. And this is in contrast with the global elites, to use Castell's terminology, who are traditionally the ones who travel around the globe, who have free pass on country borders, and those are the ones who can choose to become immobile. So it's interesting to see how the pandemic reshapes urban mobility and urban sociability, and how people come up with creative ways to deal with social distancing or the risks associated with it. And why does that matter? First, mobility is not always good, and creativity is not always positive, but we've seen so often how forced mobility or the lack of mobility prevents people from having access to society and puts these people in vulnerable positions of being robbed, of losing their jobs, of getting infected. I don't have a straight answer to obviously solve this problem, and I think no one does, but I would like to highlight that all these things are interconnected. The unfolding of hybrid spaces, the differential ways people move, the construction of urban spaces and creative processes. I'm actually right now looking at the intersection of contact tracing apps, low-income communities, and location-based games, not necessarily in this order, but this is another story and topic for another talk. So thank you for listening, and thanks for watching this presentation.